Welcome back to the Now Morning Show. It's time for us to shine a spotlight on sexual harassment in the workplace.
This morning inside your spotlight, we're talking sexual harassment in the workplace. To do that, let me welcome President of HRMATT, Cavelle Joseph-St. Omer. Good morning to you, ma'am.
Good morning.
And how are you this morning?
I am good, Ruckus. How are you?
So far, so good. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this topic because we want to take it from an HR perspective and understand sexual harassment, especially in the workplace. Now, I know culturally, we have lots of things that make it questionable and make that line seem curvy to some extent, right? But can we get into, firstly, what is a definition? How do you define sexual harassment in the workplace?
Well, it's pretty, so at the basic level, it's simple. It's unwanted advances or offenses that are perhaps physical or jeering. So it includes verbal and non-verbal communication that is deemed offensive, and it doesn't have the consent of the recipient as well. To consent is a big thing as well.
Right.
Yeah.
But is it considered sexual harassment if it happens once, or does it have to happen multiple times?
Well, how you respond, the one occasion will determine sometimes if it's a repeated action, but it's definitely consistent. Harassment in itself wouldn't be one-off unless it's very severe, like something that involves assault.
Right.
But if it's just the jeering or sending photos or jokes that are inappropriate, repeatedly doing that is harassment. And therefore, once someone does not consent to that, they can now raise an issue with HR or whoever in their organization that assumes the responsibility for handling matters like that to address it in a formal way.
Now, when we talk sexual harassment, this can be both male and female, I assume, right?
Yes.
And in the workplace, does it have to be somebody that you work with, like a co-worker? Does it have to be a supervisor to somebody, a subordinate, or can it be a client, customer? Can it be any of those people committing the act of sexual harassment?
Well, the workplace the workplace have its own definition. So you do have the inter-office interactions with employees. You do have that dynamic, that power dynamic when it's a supervisor or manager harassing a subordinate. And then you do have harassment at the same level. And you do have that client employee dynamic as well too. I've spent so much time in construction, for example. So, of course, you know, as a young female, my father is a contractor, and as a young female out there, when I started working with him, he would get inappropriate comments or remarks by other persons on the site, on a construction site as well too. That is offensive sometimes. The whistling, the sooting, all these different things that are heckling and impacting your ability to perform your job and for the purpose of you being there, which is really to work. So therefore, there are so many dynamic at play with it, and that's why you have to define it by corporation policy. So companies are encouraged to have workplace policies on harassment because we don't have strong enough protections in law. So we encourage employers to have a policy. And interestingly enough, the Ministry of Labor, they do have a national standard that employers could use if they're uncertain of where to start. How do you start crafting this policy? So you could use that national standard as well.
Can you tell me off the top where that national standard starts in terms of crafting a policy?
Well, I mean, it defines what is harassment, and so that's important. It gives examples of what harassment may be, but it's not limited to those examples as well, too, because sometimes you can't think of every situation that could occur. And you know, employees will challenge you by creating their own dynamic, right?
Humans in general.
So I mean, more seriously, it depends on the nature of your organization. So we had that interesting case in your industry in Australia with Chris Gale, yes.
Oh,
and when he was being interviewed, right?
Yes.
The reporter was actually working, but he was, he was
being Chris Gale.
Yes, right? And she was clearly uncomfortable.
Right.
And therefore, that made for an interesting dynamic right there in terms of how it became harassment in her workspace. So it's all based on your organization and what defines workspace to you and what exactly the culture you're trying to create in a company as well. Because we often say here in Trinidad and Tobago, oh, the culture make you do this, or the culture make you do that.
But I do want to ask about that aspect of things, because culturally speaking, I mean, we are people that like to flirt, right? If we look at when we party, when we go out to events, when it's carnival time or whatever, our dancing is very flirtatious. The way we move is very flirtatious. I've even heard some people say that I've heard women say to me, if they walk down certain streets and they don't get at least one man suiting them, they don't feel like they look good today. So as a culture, do we encourage sexual harassment?
Well, culturally, we do have that borderline. There's a line that is drawn. And I say to employers often, you have to define what culture you are trying to create for your organization, because there's a broader country culture, and then companies have the opportunity to create a safe working environment for their employees, and you can define that through your policies, what you are willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept as well too, and what will give you certain protections, because policy also protects the employer and the employee, right? So once that is defined, and then you train your managers now, so you have to train managers and employees to understand after, especially a company policy like that, where it's behavioral, right? Culture is also a behavioral thing. So when you're trying to change workspace culture and change behaviors in the workspace, you have an obligation to train your managers and train your employees so that they understand what the employer is willing to accept and not accept. But then there's always the interesting dynamic with family-owned and managed businesses as well,
right,
which is a little bit different, but they don't escape that. They don't escape that protection that employees have when it comes to creating a safe workspace under OSH. And OSH legislation is for all of us. And people may think health and safety is just about the physical environment, ergonomics, but it's also psychological safety as well.
Right.
And if I don't feel psychologically safe because I have a manager who is constantly making inappropriate remarks, constantly passing and brushing his shoulder against me, and those are things that happen, and I've sat and I've managed several cases, even one that involved a CEO, and I could tell you that CEO, albeit innocent, because he wasn't aware of his behaviors. Yeah, he really wasn't. So there's the culture part now. So he was not being intentionally offensive,
right,
but his behavior was offensive.
Right.
And thankfully, or I should say, not thankfully, but interestingly, I was part of a session with the staff, the administrators, and they forgot that I was in the room. I was sitting in the back quietly. We had this administrative professional day, and we invited a speaker to come and speak with the staff. And they started to talk about their experiences, but they didn't realize that I was still in the room. So I sat at the back, and I sat it for a couple minutes just to hear how the session would go before making my exit. And then decided to share with the facilitator some of these experiences. And I see it throughout the entire session as a consequence of that. And then I, of course, spoke to them, assured them that they're safe to share and that I intended to address it, which I did by inviting an external person who my CEO at that point in time respected tremendously, a very senior attorney. And I had a panel discussion on a subject matter, and that in itself led to his own aha moment, because he was in his space, all the managers were there, so I didn't single out anyone.
Right.
And you saw a shift in his behavior after that session. So sometimes it also does require a bit of education for people to understand how their behaviors are, in fact, offensive.
Right.
But then you do have the serious assault type situations where someone is actually now having physical contact with employees now, or with another person, because it doesn't have to be an employer-employee or a manager-employee scenario. It could be a consultant or a contractor who is engaged by the company as well too. But remember, the company's obligation is to the employee and providing that safe workspace. And we have a duty, once reported, to treat with the issue in a confidential and serious manner as well. And yes, confidentiality is critical to protecting the victim or the person who was the victim of the assault, and also even the individual who is accused, until you investigate.
So that's what I wanted to ask about, is how do we determine, firstly, one, is this allegation true? Two, how do we treat with it if it is true? Because I know that there have been situations as well where people claim things have happened to them, and like you said, the CEO in your example, he wasn't aware that he was doing it, right? So in one instance, it could be a situation of them not being aware, but there have been other circumstances when people play victim, or they do what they need to do to claim things or allege things without actually having gone through the experience, just in order to receive whatever benefits may come out of that situation. So how do you, as an HR professional, professional investigate that process?
So you always have to investigate because a person is innocent until proven guilty. But naturally, especially when there's a direct reporting relationship, you have to separate parties during that investigative process. In some instances, the organization doesn't have the capacity to investigate, so you engage someone externally to work for you. And there are a number of organizations like the ECA who will provide such a service. And you bring
all right. Let me pause you for 1 second because unfortunately it seems like we have lost your microphone, and I don't want the audience to miss anything that you are saying here this morning because I think it's very, very valuable information as we continue to discuss sexual harassment in the workplace and how we can deal with it from, well, employee-employer perspective, also client-employee and employee-employer situations as well. And we continue to delve into it this morning. Of course, it's the hot topic of the day, and we want to make sure that everybody is getting as much information as you can to feel as empowered as you ought to feel when you're dealing with the workplace. Because as you mentioned before, the policy is meant to protect not just the employers, but the employees as well. And it's meant to make sure that everybody gets the best possible version of the situation at hand. So while we sort out the microphone and the technical challenges that we're facing here this morning, we hope to get it back up and running soon so we can continue the conversation, because I think one of the things that we need to discuss as well is the procedure to getting consequences and what is the process to report and what consequences can come as a result of sexual harassment in the workplace. So I'm trying to fill here, guys. I'm really just trying to kill time until we get back into the conversation as we sort out the technical challenges that we're having with Cavelle this morning. But it seems as though we're having even more trouble. So we might have to take a short break and come back, but I'm hoping not. Yeah, as I mentioned before, we're chatting this morning with Cavelle Joseph-St, Omer, president of HRMATT, who is just discussing the details of sexual harassment in the workplace. And if your workplace has a policy when it comes to sexual harassment, you need to find out more about it. Make sure the managers are trained from top to bottom, from the CEO all the way down. Everybody should be aware of that HR policy. Everybody should be aware of the sexual harassment policy. All right, Cavelle, we're back on and we're looking and make sure.
Yes.
Yes? All right, beautiful. All right, so we could get into some of the consequences of sexual harassment now.
Well, after the investigation, because before you even get to consequences, you have to investigate to give parties an opportunity to present their case. And in some instances, there's hard evidence, sometimes WhatsApp exchanges, emails, phone records. Right. You may have witnesses, people who have witnessed a manager or someone being inappropriate in the workspace. So there are witness statements and official statements. So I was sharing that if an organization don't have the capacity to investigate a matter themselves, then it's useful to engage external investigators because at least for me, in terms of my practice, I won't investigate a matter and then have to now advise on consequences. So you try to have a segregation of duties. And once you have that investigation, an investigator on board to meet with both parties, to examine evidence, to see if there are witnesses to a matter, and to make a determination of whether harassment as defined did occur and what type of harassment, then you deal with the consequences part. But again, you have to give the opportunity to the person who's been accused of harassment. You have to give him or her the opportunity to defend him or herself. And that often results in a tribunal, depending on how severe the issue is, a tribunal. And that person will have the opportunity to have an advisor. So sometimes they work with a union rep, sometimes they work with attorneys. The last case I did, that person had an attorney involved, there were attorneys involved because it's so serious, right? And the consequences, especially when you're dealing with people who are married, which is also another dynamic. So in that case, you had one party who was married, and therefore there are consequences to marriage and to family life as well, to based on those behaviors.
Now, Cavelle, when you start talking about that part of things, it gets even more interesting, right? Because we also know that sometimes in the workplace, people end up in relationships that, whether it be sanctioned or not sanctioned by the company, they end up in personal relationships consensually, and then things go sour.
Yes.
Right? And when things go sour, the workplace gets a little bit awkward, it gets a little bit tense, and now things that would have been normal between them before become sexual harassment because now they're no longer consenting. Now they're a little bit spiteful, now they're a little bit bad mind, as the case may be, right? How do you, in your investigations, when you find out, all right, You all were together and you all broke up, and now this is bad, it's sour. How do you deal with that as compared to somebody who is receiving unwanted advances from jump?
Well, you've seen the infamous RBC case in Canada, where that resulted in a very senior, and this was a female person in this case, being terminated, right? Sometimes it is so severe and the impact on the organization is so bad that it results in a termination. And the employer has had enough evidence to see where someone has abused their access to a person, and that has resulted in, as they say, when it goes sour. So there was an occasion where he was getting preferential treatment, because that happens, right? You're ruling high, you're getting opportunities that somebody else probably more deservedly should have gotten, but you got it because of this relationship dynamic. And then when it goes south, these are hardcore consequences that has a jarring and impactful, it impacts the employees who remain as well too, and who have witnessed it along the way. And that is why organizations have to be clear about the culture that they're trying to create and whether or not they want that kind of behavior in their workspace in the first place. But in instances, I mean, a doctor, for example, long hours, the chances of you dating or meeting someone, I mean, it's slim. Your workspace become your dating ground.
You're going to end up dating people you're working with.
Right? So in some professions, because of the nature of it, you find yourself, you don't have much opportunities to go out there and date. And that is why there is a love contract now. The love contract where people have to declare their relationships to the employer. You have to now come to HR and say, here what, I am in a relationship with Jill, Jack and Jill together, and that is declared. So that protects the organization, and the employer now can make the determination whether Jack and Jill needs to be separated. So in the banking sector, you see, I mean, there's so many locations.
So
Jack and Jill, they put them at a different location. They make sure that they're not reporting to each other. So the bank is not saying, don't have your relationship, but let us know so we could address it, declare it. Now, if it's not declared, and you're coming to say that to us now, especially that's why policy is so important. So if after I've laid a policy and I say, you have to sign my love contract, and you don't, and you were to come to me now to report it, then you are in breach. And consequences up to termination.
The consequences range as far as termination. That's what it boils down to. Cavelle, unfortunately, we're out of time this morning, but I thank you very much for taking the time to come and share with us this information, because I think it's really, really important, especially in the national conversation that's happening right now. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think this topic in particular requires a lot more conversations around it. And also it may need the backing of law. So if I'm in Jamaica, Belize, and Barbados, they have laws. We have to rely on 3 pieces of legislation: Sexual Offences Act, and that's only when it becomes, there's bodily interaction. There's the USH legislation, and of course there's the Equal Opportunities Act, but you have to prove that you were assaulted or you're the victim of discrimination.
Discrimination of some sort.
Yes,
Ladies and gentlemen, Cavelle Joseph-St, Omer, President of HRMATT, joining us this morning to share a little bit about sexual harassment in the workplace and the policies behind it. Let's take a quick break and we come back with more in our morning show. Stay tuned.
You want to rape? Take this. You want to rape? Take that.